The clinking of crystal glasses masked the ruthless deals being made at table 4. Lorenzo Falcone thought he was untouchable, mocking the quiet American waitress in the dead, blood-soaked language of the Palermo underworld. He expected her to blush and walk away. Instead, she locked eyes with him and answered back. The air inside Il Vento, an impossibly exclusive Italian restaurant nestled in the heart of Tribeca, was thick with the scent of white truffles, roasted garlic, and old money. For Audrey Sinclair, the dim, amber-lit dining room had been a sanctuary for the past 3 years. She was a ghost in a tailored black vest and a crisp white apron. With her pale skin, unassuming posture, and a name tag that read her decidedly Anglo-Saxon name, she blended perfectly into the background. She was just another struggling New Yorker paying rent, invisible to the billionaires, hedge fund managers, and politicians who frequented the establishment. But tonight, the atmosphere shifted. The low, pleasant hum of dinner conversation died a sudden death when the heavy mahogany front doors swung open. Alessandro, the usually composed maitre d', visibly paled. He practically sprinted to the front, bowing his head lower than strictly necessary. Audrey, polishing a wine glass behind the mahogany bar, didn't need to look up to know who had arrived. The sudden drop in room temperature and the collective held breath of the waitstaff told her everything. It was Lorenzo Falcone. Lorenzo wasn't just a made man. He was the heir apparent to the Falcone Syndicate, a brutal and fiercely traditional organization that controlled the docks from Brooklyn to Newark. He moved with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal Zegna suit that hid the lethal lines of his body, Lorenzo had the kind of dark, devastating Roman features that belonged on a classical statue if the statue had a soul forged in ice. He was flanked by his 2 most trusted capos. Silvio, a hulking man with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and Dante, slender, sharply dressed, and possessing the dead eyes of a career hitman. Table 4. Audrey, Alessandro hissed, suddenly appearing at her elbow. His forehead was slick with nervous sweat. You are on table 4. Do not speak unless spoken to. Pour the wine, serve the food, and become invisible. Understand? Audrey nodded once, her face an unreadable mask. Yes, Alessandro. Table 4 was the private alcove in the deep back, shadowed by heavy velvet curtains. As Audrey approached with a silver tray holding 3 menus and a carafe of chilled water, she observed the men. They were already completely relaxed, having claimed the space as their own personal fiefdom. Good evening, gentlemen, Audrey said, her voice pitched to a soft, polite, distinctly American cadence. Welcome to Il Vento. May I start you off with some sparkling water, or perhaps a bottle of red? Lorenzo didn't even look at her. He waved a hand dismissively, his dark, heavy-lidded eyes fixed on Dante across the table. Bring the 15 Barolo and the antipasto platter. Go. He didn't say please. He didn't acknowledge her humanity. To Lorenzo Falcone, she was a piece of the restaurant's furniture, functional and entirely beneath his notice. Audrey offered a tight, professional smile that none of them saw, turned on her heel, and retreated. By the time she returned with the $300 bottle of Barolo, the men had descended into deep, hushed conversation. As she stepped into the alcove, the language abruptly switched from English to Italian. But it wasn't the clean, melodic Italian taught in language schools, nor was it the generic American Italian slang of the New York boroughs. It was Sicilian, and not just any Sicilian, it was Palermitano, the heavy, guttural, ancient dialect spoken in the deep, winding alleys of Palermo. It was a language designed to keep secrets, full of clipped vowels and aggressive consonants. Audrey's heart gave a violent, painful thud against her ribs, but her hands, expertly uncorking the wine, remained perfectly steady. She knew that dialect. She knew it intimately. Before she was Audrey Sinclair, hiding in plain sight in Manhattan. She was a terrified teenager, locked in a gilded cage on the Via Maqueda in Palermo. Her mother had been the tragic, beautiful, American mistress of Don Vincenzo, a brutal rival to the Falcone family's ancestors. For 10 years, Audrey had lived in the shadows of the Sicilian Mafia, soaking up their language, their brutal codes, and their darkest secrets, until the night the estate burned, and she barely escaped with her life and a forged passport. "Look at this one," Silvio grunted in thick Sicilian, leaning back in his chair and gesturing vaguely toward Audrey as she poured the dark red wine into Lorenzo's glass. Pale as a ghost. "I bet there's absolutely nothing behind those blue eyes." "Fucking American sheep," Dante chuckled. A dry, raspy sound. "She probably thinks we're talking about the pasta." Audrey's face remained placid. She moved to Silvio's glass, pouring the exact measure, not spilling a single drop. She let her eyes glaze over slightly, playing the part of the oblivious, uncomprehending servant perfectly. Lorenzo finally turned his head, his cold, obsidian eyes dragging lazily over Audrey's form. There was no lust in his gaze, only a chilling, absolute arrogance. He took a sip of the Barolo she had just poured. "Leave the girl alone, Silvio," Lorenzo said, his Sicilian rolling off his tongue with dark, aristocratic authority. "She serves a purpose. She brings the wine. She carries the plates. She's a simpleton, deaf and dumb to the world that actually matters. It's a peaceful way to live. Being stupid is a luxury we don't have." Silvio laughed louder. "True, boss. But honestly, if you put a gun to her head right now, she'd probably apologize for inconveniencing you." Audrey stepped back, resting the bottle on the table with a soft clink. "I will put the antipasto order in." "Excuse me," she said in bright, flawless, oblivious English. As she walked away, she heard Lorenzo's low voice switch back to the dialect. "Forget the waitress. Tomorrow night, we move on the docks. The Russians think they have the Union boss in their pocket. They don't know I have his daughter." Audrey's breath hitched in her throat as she pushed through the swinging doors into the chaotic heat of the kitchen. She pressed her back against the cold stainless steel of the prep counter, closing her eyes. He has the Union boss's daughter. The Falcones were planning a hostile takeover of the shipping yards, and they were using a kidnapping as leverage. This wasn't just mob gossip. This was a major federal crime being discussed openly over a bottle of wine, all because Lorenzo Falcone was too arrogant to believe a simple waitress could understand the language of his ancestors. Audrey knew she should walk away. She should serve their food, take her tip, and forget everything she heard. Survival meant staying invisible. But as she stood there, the ghosts of Palermo whispered in her ears. She remembered the arrogance of men just like Lorenzo, men who treated women like collateral damage, men who thought they owned the world simply because they spoke the language of violence. She grabbed the heavy silver tray laden with imported prosciutto, burrata, and roasted peppers. Her knuckles were white. The invisible American waitress was about to clock out. The dining room had quieted further as the evening wore on. The jazz band in the corner played a low, morning saxophone solo that seemed to perfectly underscore the tension vibrating around table 4. Audrey approached the alcove for the third time. The men were leaning in close, their voices dropping an octave. "If the Russian pushes back," Lorenzo was saying, in that heavy, gravelly Sicilian, swirling the blood-red wine in his glass, "you don't shoot him. You break his knees. Then you send a piece of the girl's jewelry to his house. A necklace, an earring. Make him bleed from the inside before you finish him." "And what if the police are already watching the warehouse?" Dante asked, his eyes darting around the restaurant purely out of habit. Lorenzo scoffed, a dark, cruel sound. He looked up just as Audrey reached the table to set down the heavy antipasto platter. "The police are like this little waitress," Lorenzo sneered in Sicilian, his eyes locking onto Audrey's face, daring her to understand his mockery. Blind, deaf, utterly useless. If you told this stupid American bird that she was serving death on a silver platter, she'd just smile and ask if we wanted fresh Parmesan. Silvio grinned, looking at Audrey. Hey, sweetheart, you want to come sit on my lap and let me teach you a real language? He asked, the Sicilian words dripping with crude malice. Audrey slowly set the silver tray down on the center of the table. She didn't immediately pull her hands away. She kept them resting on the edges of the tray, grounding herself. The air in her lungs felt like liquid nitrogen. The fear that had kept her hiding for 3 years suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing fury. Men like Lorenzo Falcone had taken her childhood. They had taken her mother. She refused to let them take her dignity in her own place of work. Audrey slowly stood up straight. She didn't put on her customer service smile. Instead, the soft, subservient posture she had maintained all evening vanished. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, and her blue eyes turned to ice. She looked directly at Silvio first, her gaze cutting through him like a scalpel. I would rather sit on a bed of rusty nails than let a filthy, bottom-feeding dog like you breathe in my direction, Audrey said. The words did not come out in English. They rolled off her tongue in flawless, razor-sharp, aristocratic Palermitano Sicilian. The dialect was heavier, older, and far more refined than the street-level slang Silvio used. It was the Sicilian, spoken by the true dons of the old country. Silvio's jaw dropped. The crude smirk slid off his face so fast it was almost comical. Audrey didn't stop there. She slowly turned her head, fixing her piercing gaze directly onto Lorenzo Falcone. The Mafia Boss was frozen, his wineglass halted halfway to his mouth. For the first time all evening, the supreme arrogance in his dark eyes had fractured, replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. And as for you, Don Falcone, Audrey continued, her Sicilian dripping with venomous sarcasm, dropping his title like a gauntlet on the table. I am not deaf, I am not blind, and I am certainly not stupid. The wine I just poured you comes from the Piedmont region, not Sicily, which shows your taste is as hollow as your threats. Furthermore, if you are stupid enough to discuss kidnapping a union boss's daughter in a public restaurant, simply because you think you are the only one in the world who speaks the language of murderers, then you are not an apex predator. She leaned in slightly, resting her palms flat on the table, invading his personal space. You are just a loud, arrogant boy playing dress-up in your father's suits, she whispered, the Sicilian dialect rolling with deadly precision. Enjoy your prosciutto, stronzo, asshole. For 5 agonizing seconds, the silence at table 4 was absolute. It was a suffocating, violent quiet. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to vanish into a vacuum. Then, Dante moved. Faster than lightning, his hand vanished beneath his tailored jacket, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his concealed weapon. Silvio, recovering from his shock, began to rise from his chair, his face flushing a violent, dangerous red. You fucking bitch, Silvio snarled. Stop. Lorenzo's voice wasn't loud, but it cracked like a whip across the table. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't even blink. He just spoke the single word in English, and both of his capos froze instantly, deferring to the absolute authority of their boss. Lorenzo slowly, deliberately, placed his wineglass back onto the table. He didn't look at his men. His dark, intense eyes were entirely consumed by Audrey. He looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost, or perhaps a mythical creature that had just manifested in the middle of Manhattan. The shock in his expression was rapidly morphing into something far more dangerous. It was an intense, predatory curiosity. Who are you? Lorenzo asked. His voice was dangerously soft, reverting to the Sicilian dialect, testing her, probing the depths of her knowledge. I am the waitress, Audrey replied coldly in the same dialect, refusing to back down, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. And you are holding up my section. Lorenzo ignored her deflection. He tilted his head, studying the angles of her face, the defiant set of her jaw. "That accent?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. "That isn't something you pick up from a textbook or a grandmother in Bensonhurst. That is the old dialect, the blood dialect of the Corleonese faction. You speak like you were raised in the halls of the Cosa Nostra." Audrey's breath hitched infinitesimally, but it was enough. Lorenzo caught the micro-expression. A slow, chilling smile spread across his handsome face. It was a terrifying sight. A blonde, blue-eyed American girl named Audrey, hiding in a Tribeca restaurant, speaking the language of my enemies perfectly. Lorenzo mused, leaning forward until the scent of his expensive cologne and the metallic tang of impending violence washed over her. "You aren't just a waitress, cara mia. You are a ghost. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life by letting me hear your voice." "My only mistake," Audrey shot back, gripping her empty serving tray like a shield, "was assuming you had the manners to match your expensive suit. If you'll excuse me, I have other tables to attend to." She turned to leave, desperate to escape the gravitational pull of his dark, evaluating stare. But before she could take a single step, Lorenzo's hand shot out. His grip clamped around her slender wrist like a steel vise. It wasn't tight enough to bruise, but it was immovable. Audrey gasped, trying to yank her arm away, but he held fast, his thumb pressing against her racing pulse. "You aren't going anywhere," Lorenzo said, switching seamlessly to flawless, unaccented English, his voice a low, commanding rumble. "You know about the docks. You know about the girl, which means you are coming with us. Either you walk out the front door on my arm looking like you just got the best tip of your life, or Silvio carries you out the back door in a garbage bag." Audrey looked down at the hand restraining her, then up into Lorenzo's merciless eyes. She realized with a sinking dread that she hadn't just exposed her secret. She had accidentally walked straight back into the violent underworld she had sacrificed everything to escape. Lorenzo Falcone wasn't just mocking a waitress anymore. He had found a puzzle, a liability, and a ghost from the old country. And a mafia boss never left a loose end untied. "Choose, Audrey," Lorenzo whispered. The dining room of Il Vento was a theater, and Audrey Sinclair had just been shoved onto center stage without a script. Lorenzo's thumb pressed against her radial artery, feeling the frantic, hummingbird rhythm of her pulse. His dark eyes were bottomless, stripping away the invisible armor she had spent 3 years building. The threat was explicit. Walk out on his arm as a willing companion, or be carried out as a corpse. "Smile, Audrey," Lorenzo commanded softly in English, the smooth, cultured timbre of his voice at terrifying odds with the violence of his words. "Make it look like I just charmed you out of your apron." Survival instinct, honed from a childhood spent navigating the treacherous halls of a Sicilian compound, kicked in. Audrey forced the muscles in her face to obey, stretching her lips into a shy, flattered smile. She reached up with her free hand and unpinned her crisp white apron, letting it pool onto the floor beside table 4. "Alessandro," Lorenzo called out, his voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the restaurant. The maitre d' materialized instantly, his eyes darting to the discarded apron and then to Lorenzo's iron grip on Audrey's wrist. He swallowed hard. "Yes, Don Falcone? The service tonight was exceptional. The waitress has agreed to show me the city, put her entire shift on my tab, and add 10,000 for her time." Lorenzo didn't wait for a response. He stood up, towering over Audrey, and smoothly pulled her against his side, his arm wrapped around her waist, a gesture that looked intimately possessive to the room, but felt like a steel trap to Audrey. Silvio and Dante rose silently, flanking them like 2 heavily armed shadows. As Lorenzo guided her through the dining room, Audrey kept her eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany doors. She felt the stares of the elite clientele burning into her back, but no one intervened. In New York City, Money and power were the only true religions, and Lorenzo Falcone was a high priest. The crisp, biting November air hit Audrey's face as they stepped onto the Tribeca pavement. An idling, armored Mercedes-Maybach S. 680 guard, a $500,000 fortress on wheels, was waiting at the curb. Dante opened the rear door, his dead eyes fixed on the street. "Get in," Lorenzo murmured, his hand sliding to the small of her back to give her a firm, inescapable push. Audrey slid into the cavernous back seat, the scent of rich, bespoke leather and Lorenzo's dark cedarwood cologne instantly suffocating her. Lorenzo slid in beside her, while Silvio took the wheel, and Dante rode shotgun. The heavy doors closed with a solid, hermetic thud, cutting off the sounds of the city entirely. The Maybach pulled away, gliding smoothly toward the FDR drive. For 10 agonizing minutes, the silence in the car was absolute. The partition between the front and rear seats was rolled down, but Silvio and Dante didn't utter a word. Lorenzo sat casually, his long legs stretched out, swirling the lingering taste of the Barolo in his mouth as he stared out the tinted window at the passing city lights. Finally, he turned his head to look at her. The ambient streetlights cast harsh, moving shadows across his sharp cheekbones. "Audrey Sinclair," Lorenzo said, testing the syllables on his tongue. He let out a low, humorless chuckle. "It sounds like a name you picked out of a mid-century catalog. It's entirely too hollow for a girl who speaks the blood dialect of the Corleonesi." Audrey kept her gaze straight ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "I don't know what you're talking about. I learned Italian from my grandmother in Queens." Lorenzo moved faster than she could blink. His hand shot out, his long fingers wrapping around her jaw, forcing her to look at him. His grip was firm, tilting her face up toward the dim cabin light. "Do not insult my intelligence," Lorenzo warned, his voice dropping an octave, slipping seamlessly back into that heavy, guttural Sicilian. "Your vowels are clipped. Your phrasing is archaic. You speak the language of men who have been dead for 50 years, men who ruled Palermo before the Falcones ever set foot in America. You didn't learn that in Queens. You learned that behind high stone walls." Audrey's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze with defiant ice. "If you know so much about it, then you should know that women who speak that dialect don't answer to men who threaten them in the back of luxury cars." A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Lorenzo's eyes, quickly replaced by a dangerous, predatory amusement. He released her jaw, his fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against her pale skin. "Brave. Or suicidal," Lorenzo noted, leaning back against the headrest. "My men are currently sweeping your apartment. By morning, I will know every fake alias you've ever used, every bank account you've opened, and every shadow you've hidden in." Panic spiked in Audrey's chest. Under her floorboards in Brooklyn was a locked metal box containing her real passport, the one bearing the surname of a rival Sicilian don, and the charred remains of her mother's diary. If Lorenzo found that, he wouldn't just kill her. He would torture her for information on her family's remaining loyalists. She had to pivot. She had to give him a piece of the truth to hide the whole. "You won't find anything," Audrey said, her voice steadying, "because there is nothing to find. I was a maid, an orphan, taken in by the Inzerillo estate in Palermo. I cleaned their floors, I served their wine, and I kept my mouth shut while the dons discussed their business. When the estate burned down 3 years ago, I ran. That's all." Lorenzo stared at her, analyzing her micro-expressions, weighing the lie against the truth. The Inzerillo family had been brutally wiped out by a rival faction. Everyone in the underworld knew that. It was a plausible story. A traumatized servant, escaping the slaughter. "A maid," Lorenzo repeated softly. He reached out and picked up her right hand. He ran his thumb over her palm, then along the tips of her fingers. Soft hands for a girl who supposedly scrubbed stone floors. No calluses. No burns. and an aristocratic posture that you can't quite hide, even when you're serving cheap pasta to tourists. He dropped her hand. You're a liar, Audrey, but you are a fascinating liar. And right now, you are my problem. The Maybach slowed, turning into the private, subterranean parking garage of a glittering glass high-rise in Battery Park City. The reinforced steel gates closed behind them, sealing Audrey inside Lorenzo Falcone's world. The penthouse was a masterclass in sterile, intimidating luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the Statue of Liberty and the inky black waters of the harbor. The floors were polished black marble, and the minimalist furniture was sleek, cold, and undoubtedly Italian. Dante had confiscated Audrey's phone the moment she stepped out of the car. Silvio had been dismissed to the lobby, leaving Audrey entirely alone, with Lorenzo in the sprawling, silent living room. Lorenzo walked over to a custom-built wet bar. He poured 2 fingers of Macallan 25 into a crystal tumbler and turned to face her. He didn't offer her a drink. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to a low, white leather sofa. Audrey remained standing near the entryway, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. I prefer to stand. What do you want from me? You know I heard you talking about the union boss's daughter. If you're going to kill me to keep me quiet, just get it over with. Lorenzo took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. If I wanted you dead, you would currently be feeding the crabs at the bottom of the East River. No, Audrey. You are alive because you are an anomaly. And in my business, anomalies are either lethal threats or incredibly useful tools. He walked slowly toward her, the ice clinking in his glass. You understand the old ways. You know the players. Even if you claim to just be a maid, the Russian faction that is trying to take my docks, the Volkov Syndicate, they are using a middleman to hide their financial trail, a ghost, someone who knows how to move money without triggering the feds. Lorenzo stopped a few feet away from her. The imposing height and sheer physical presence of the man were suffocating. We traced one of the Volkov's wire transfers to an offshore account managed by a private wealth firm, Coutts, in London, Lorenzo explained, watching her face closely. But the authorization signature wasn't Russian. It was Sicilian. The Volkovs have hired an exile from the old country to manage their hostile takeover. A man who goes by the alias, the Architect. Audrey's blood ran cold. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The Architect. She knew that name. It wasn't just a rumor. It was a ghost from her own nightmares. The Architect was the man who had designed the security protocols for the Inzerillo estate, and the man who had sold the bypass codes to their enemies, leading to the massacre that killed her mother. Lorenzo saw the microscopic flinch in her eyes. He stepped closer, invading her space, until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. You recognize the name, Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. It wasn't a question. Your heart rate just doubled. The blood just drained from your face. Who is he? Audrey backed up until her shoulder blades hit the cold, floor-to-ceiling glass window. There was nowhere left to run. Below her, the city lights blurred into a sea of meaningless electricity. If I tell you, Audrey said, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to control it, you have no reason to keep me alive. If you don't tell me, Lorenzo countered, reaching out to rest his hand flat against the glass right next to her head, caging her in, I will hand you over to Dante. And Dante is not a gentleman. Dante is a blunt instrument, Audrey shot back, her Sicilian temper finally breaking through her carefully constructed American facade. He can pull fingernails, but he can't read offshore financial ledgers encoded in the old Palermo ciphers. If this Architect is who I think he is, he doesn't use computers to hide his money. He uses the old ledger systems. Family codes. You could torture me for a month, and you still wouldn't be able to decipher his books. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. The air between them crackled with a sudden, violent tension. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by a woman, and certainly not by a hostage. But rather than anger, Audrey saw a dark, consuming intrigue flare in his obsidian eyes. "And you can?" Lorenzo asked softly. "I can," Audrey lied, leaning into the bluff with everything she had. She had seen the ledgers as a child, though she couldn't read them perfectly, but she knew enough to buy herself time. "But I have terms." Lorenzo let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was a dark, terrifying sound. "Terms? You are a captive in my penthouse, wearing a cheap polyester blouse, and you want to negotiate terms with the head of the Falcone family?" "Yes," Audrey said, locking her gaze with his. "I want protection. I want my passport back from wherever your men just stole it. And when I give you the architect, I want to be the one who decides how he dies." The silence that followed was deafening. Lorenzo stared down at her, the calculating machinery of his mind working behind his eyes. He realized in that moment that the woman standing before him was not a maid, and she was certainly not a waitress. She was a weapon, forged in the same violent fires that had shaped him, hiding behind a facade of fragile glass. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors of the penthouse swung open. Silvio rushed in, completely bypassing the standard protocol of knocking. His face was pale, the jagged scar on his eyebrow standing out starkly against his skin. "Boss," Silvio said, his voice tight, "we have a problem. The Russians didn't just take the Union boss's daughter, they moved her." Lorenzo didn't look away from Audrey. "Where?" "Teterboro Airport," Silvio replied, catching his breath. "They're putting her on a private Gulfstream in an hour. If that plane takes off for Moscow, we lose the docks entirely. And—" Silvio hesitated, glancing nervously at Audrey. "Speak," Lorenzo barked. "Our inside man at Kroll Security just intercepted a passenger manifest for that flight." Silvio swallowed hard. "The Volkovs aren't flying alone. The architect is on that plane." Audrey's breath caught in her throat. The man who had orchestrated the murder of her family was an hour away from slipping out of the country forever. Lorenzo slowly turned his head to look at Silvio, but his hand remained firmly planted on the glass next to Audrey's head, keeping her pinned. "Get Dante," Lorenzo ordered, his voice suddenly void of all emotion, a terrifying calm washing over him. "Arm the men. We are going to Teterboro." He looked back down at Audrey, his dark eyes glittering with a lethal, intoxicating promise. "It seems we are going to find out just how useful you are, Katerina." He reached out, his fingers catching a stray lock of her blonde hair, tucking it gently, almost affectionately, behind her ear. The contrast between the tender gesture and the violent reality of their situation sent a shiver down her spine. "If you are lying to me," Lorenzo whispered, his lips grazing her earlobe, "I will let Dante throw you out of the plane while we are over the Atlantic. But if you help me break this man," he pulled back, his gaze burning into hers, "then I will hand you the gun myself." The armored Maybach tore through the neon-lit arteries of Manhattan. Inside, Lorenzo had transformed from an arrogant billionaire into the ruthlessly efficient warlord of the Falcone Syndicate. From a hidden compartment, Dante produced a matte black case of suppressed weaponry. "The Volkovs are at Teterboro," Lorenzo said over the engine's roar, slipping a submachine gun onto a tactical sling. He reached into the case, pulled out a Beretta 92 FS, and held it out to Audrey. "Do you know how to use this, Katerina?" he asked, using her real name. Audrey took the cold, heavy weapon. "My mother taught me," she lied flawlessly, right before the architect sent the men who killed her. Lorenzo smirked. "Stay behind Dante. We aren't leaving without the Union boss's daughter, and you aren't leaving without your revenge." They bypassed the main airport entrances, rolling to a silent stop near a maintenance gate. Ahead, bathed in the harsh glare of the tarmac floodlights, idled a gleaming white Gulfstream G650. 4 Russian guards in tactical gear stood near the air stairs. Lorenzo raised 2 fingers. Dante and Silvio moved like phantoms. Ft, ft. 2 suppressed shots dropped the first guards. Lorenzo stepped from the shadows and eliminated the remaining 2 before they could draw. Clear, Dante hissed. Lorenzo grabbed Audrey's arm, hauling her up the stairs. They stormed the plush, cream-leather cabin. In the rear, a terrified young blonde woman, Chloe Sullivan, was zip-tied to a chair. Standing over her, desperately trying to open a metal briefcase, was a silver-haired man in a rumpled, bespoke suit. Audrey stopped dead. It was Salvatore Rossi, the Inzerillo family's trusted consigliere, the architect who had sold the bypass codes and left her mother to burn. Salvatore looked up in terror, his eyes locking onto Audrey. The color drained from his face. "Caterina?" he breathed. "It cannot be. You burned." "I crawled out through the wine cellar." "Salvatore," Audrey replied in heavy Palermitano, the dialect dripping like acid. "While you counted the blood money." "Wait! Don Falcone!" Salvatore shrieked in broken English, dropping to his knees. He kicked the open briefcase toward Lorenzo, spilling dozens of black, leather-bound books. "I have the Volkov accounts. 300 million, cleanly washed. Only I can read the ciphers." Lorenzo looked at the ledgers, then at Audrey. Is he telling the truth? Audrey picked up a book, flicking through pages of seemingly random numbers and outdated Sicilian poetry. "It's the Pizzino cipher," she said coldly. "The Volkov money is in a dummy corporation in Cyprus." She tossed the book down. "He's useless to you, Lorenzo. I can read his books. But I want what you promised me." Lorenzo stared at her, mesmerized by the lethal grace of the woman who, hours ago, was serving him wine. A devastating smile spread across his face. He gestured to the trembling old man. "The Falcones honor their debts, Caterina. He is yours." "Caterina, please," Salvatore begged. "I had no choice. I am your blood." "You stopped being my blood the night my mother screamed," Audrey said. She raised the beretta, locking her elbows. She didn't hesitate. She looked the architect dead in the eyes, letting him see the ghost of the Inzerillo Empire. Bang! Salvatore slumped backward, a precise hole between his eyes. Silence rushed back into the jet, broken only by Chloe's muffled sobbing. Audrey lowered the gun. A terrifying peace washed over her. The waitress was dead. Lorenzo stepped close, gently taking the warm beretta and passing it to Dante. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "You are never wearing an apron again, Caterina," he murmured, his thumb tracing her jaw. "Tomorrow, we decode the books. Then, we take the city." Audrey leaned into his touch, a dangerous smile gracing her lips. "Make sure you order the right wine next time, Lorenzo, or I'll have to correct you again." The crystal glasses at Il Vento still clink, but Audrey Sinclair no longer pours the wine. She sits at table 4, draped in bespoke Italian silk, speaking the blood dialect of Palermo with the man who once mocked her. Lorenzo Falcone learned the hard way that silence isn't always submission. Sometimes, the quietest girl in the room is just waiting for the perfect moment to burn the empire down.